Hi, my name is Logan Graham.
And my name is Chloe Storm.
We chose to do our video project on two-spirit individuals, homosexuality, and gender nonconformance in Indigenous societies. Before we begin, it is important to recognize that we are both from settler backgrounds and are approaching this subject from an outside lens. We are also both on the LGBTQIA+ spectrum, so our worldviews have been shaped by our own experiences with homosexuality and homophobia. However, we acknowledge that we cannot relate to the experience of being two-spirit, as it is an Indigenous exclusive identity. The purpose of this video is to help with the decolonization and indigenization of knowledge as an act of reconciliation. We aim to recognize Indigenous history that has been purposely erased and omitted. We wish to make this knowledge more accessible and to bring attention to two-spirit voices and stories.
Before we answer the question, why was the Indigenous worldview more accepting of two-spirit and LGBTQIA+ people than the European worldview was? It is important that we explain what two-spirit means. The term two-spirit is a recently created umbrella term used to describe a wide variety of traditions and social roles that exist outside of the European gender binary. The term two-spirit originated in the Northern Algonquin dialect as Niz Manitoag, literally two spirits, and was chosen at the third annual spiritual gathering of gay and lesbian Native people in Winnipeg in 1990. It refers to the presence of two spirits, one masculine and one feminine inside of one person. Today, it also includes different sexualities as well as gender identities. As Beverly Little Thunder wrote, "No one person can speak for so many Native two-spirit people. No single term can apply to all of us at a single time." Furthermore, the two-spirit identity is intrinsically linked with aspects of Indigenous culture. The term two-spirit is also closely linked with spiritual and ceremonial traditions and relationships with Aboriginal history, community, and land. This makes it fundamentally distinct from other queer identities, as two-spirit can apply to a very broad category of people, experiences, and nations. We have decided to focus on the Sauk and Meskwaki people of what is now northwestern Illinois, the Apsaluuk Nation of the Yellowstone River Valley, and the Kanaka Maoli of Hawaii. Now, in order to better analyze two-spirit and queer identities in Indigenous culture, we have also decided to analyze how queer identities were viewed by the colonial powers. For sake of time, we are providing a very brief overview of where a great deal of homophobia and discrimination stems from in settler society.
In Europe, a great deal of homophobia stems from strictly enforced gender roles, as well as the fact that the Church condemned sodomites. At first, sodomy only referred to men who engaged in same-sex sexual relations, but during the Renaissance, the definition of sodomy was extended to any non-procreative sexual intercourse. The Church often blames sodomites for natural catastrophe, and in Homophobia, a History, Bernfon quotes Roman Emperor Justinian as having said, "Because of such crimes, there are famines, earthquakes, and pestilences." A great deal of this belief comes from the idea that homosexuality, or existing outside of the Western gender binary, goes against nature. To quote the Theodosian Code, "Praiseworthy is your practice of seizing all who have committed the crime of treating their male bodies as though they were female, submitting them to the use becoming the opposite sex, and being in no wise distinguishable from women." This sentiment has lasted until the present day. Much of the fear and disgust thrown at queer people is often attributed to effeminacy in men and men performing feminine roles in society. Deep down, homophobia and transphobia are inherently linked to sexism and gender discrimination, because what man would ever choose to suffer the societal position assigned to women?
At the time of colonization, settlers were horrified to find that many Indigenous communities across North America did not abide by the strict gender roles that were rampant in Europe, with many colonizers making note of people they called berdache, in reference to men who assumed the role of women by working, farming, and being sexually available to other men, rather than hunting and fighting. Settlers also found many people they considered men who chose to wear women's clothing and garb their entire lives. This shock at finding these types of people contributed to the colonial powers' attempt to wipe out the Indigenous populations, believing they were helping to cleanse this new land of a most ancient sin. Before we begin our analysis, we would like to clarify some terms used throughout our project. We frequently use the term assigned male or female at birth to help clarify some of the more specific examples of two-spirit people that we talk about. However, we acknowledge that these are modern terms that are not culturally accurate.
Historically, many indigenous cultures recognized a third or fourth gender. These genders are difficult to describe coming from a Western worldview, where everything must fit into a binary. They translate literally into woman like man or man like woman, although these translations are problematic when defined in a Western worldview, because they are limited by the idea of a male female binary. It is also important to note that in nations that had a concept of being two-spirit, relationships between two-spirit and cisgendered people were considered homosexual in the Western definition of that term. However, the native view of such relationships was more complex, as two-spirit individuals were considered part of a separate third or fourth gender identity. For example, an assigned male at birth, two-spirit individual in a relationship with a cisgendered man would not have been seen as a same-sex relationship, but rather a relationship between two people of different genders.
Due to colonialism and the rewriting of history, a lot of our sources originate from settler explorers and anthropologists. We must therefore read them critically to recognize biases. A good example of this is George Catlin's painting, Dance to the Berdache. When Catlin, an American painter, visited and researched a Sauk and Meskwaki village in northwestern Illinois, he encountered a two-spirit person and witnessed a ritual which he then painted and called Dance to the Berdache, in which a two-spirit person, whom Catlin refers to as a Berdache, is honored through dance and feast, as they are seen as having a special medicinal or spiritual role in their community. Catlin, however, was extremely biased in his description of this dance, stating that this is one of the most unaccountable and disgusting customs that I have ever met in the Indian country. I should wish that it might be extinguished before it be more fully recorded. This statement in his recording of the existence of gender nonconforming people proves his bias in an explicit manner.
Before we continue with our analysis, we would like to take a moment to address the term berdache. This term was originally used by Europeans to describe men who dressed effeminately or had relations with other men. Anthropologists use the term to describe indigenous people who were gender nonconforming or in same-sex relationships. Today, it is a pejorative term. Due to its negative connotation, it was replaced by the term two-spirit in 1990. As such, even though it is not historically accurate, as the term did not exist at the time, we will be using the term two-spirit to replace berdache throughout the rest of this video.
The Apsaluki nation, also known as the Crow Nation, was another nation that differed greatly from the European viewpoint. Not only did the Apsaluki recognize a third gender, the Bote, who were assigned male at birth people who filled female roles in their society, but they were also a matrilineal tribe that openly embraced same-sex relations, divorce, premarital sex, and extramarital sex. An example of gender nonconformance found within the Apsaluki is a woman named Biawachieche, better known as Woman Chief in English. Biawachieche, Woman Chief, was a two-spirit woman who did not cross-dress, but took on male roles in her society, such as leading war parties, and she was highly praised for her prowess in battle. She also married 4 women and gained high stature in her tribe, attaining a position normally held by men. Colonials did not treat gender nonconforming women the same way as they treated gender nonconforming men, since they saw the former as women aspiring to be like men, reinforcing the idea that masculinity was superior. Furthermore, assigned female at birth two-spirit people were often stereotyped as the Indian princess and were mythologized by settler colonials. James Beckworth writes about a warrior woman named Pineleaf, who is believed to be heavily inspired by Biawachieche. He romanticizes her story, describing his attempts to get her to marry him.
People were determined to be bote based on their habits as children, where if a young boy was naturally inclined towards women's work, they would be given women's clothing at around the age of 13. They would then spend their lives filling that role, often excelling at their tasks as they did not need to take time off for having children. Bote people also fulfilled a special religious role as well, during the Sundance ceremony. In the book Changing Ones, Third and Fourth Genders in Native North America, an Apsaluki elder is quoted as saying, "We don't waste people the way white society does. Every person has their gift." One example of a famous Bote person is Oshtish. Oshtish was a Bote who fought in the Battle of Rosebud during the Great Sioux War of 1876. Although some sources use he-him pronouns to describe Oshtish, we will be using she-her pronouns to address her.
The name Oshtish translates to finds them and kills them, which references her great skill and bravery in battle. The story of Oshtish in battle was told by a Crow woman named Pretty Shield, who witnessed these events as a young woman. She describes Oshtish as neither man nor woman. She looked like a man, and yet she wore women's clothing, and she had the heart of a woman. Oshtish went into battle, and during the fight, a warrior named Bullsnake was wounded and fell from his horse. Oshtish jumped from her horse and bravely stood above him to defend him, shooting at the attacker. With the help of a woman named the Other Magpie, they both took down the oncoming threat. In the late 1890s, an agent tried to force Oshtish to wear men's clothing and conform to the masculine gender roles, but the members of her community stood up against this injustice. The chief of the Apsaluki Nation, Pretty Eagle, went to the agent and told him to leave the reservation. The Apsaluki Nation were known to be so accepting of Two-Spirit people that the last Two-Spirit person of the Hisatsa, a neighboring nation, fled to the Apsaluki for protection from forced assimilation and violence.
The final nation we are analyzing for our project are the indigenous people of Hawaii, the Kanaka Maoli. In the documentary Kumuhina, the third gender Mahu is described as those who embrace both the feminine and masculine traits that are embodied within each and every one of us. Mahu is seen as a gender that exists somewhere in the middle of male and female. The Mahu filled both a spiritual role as well as a caretaker role in Hawaiian society and were highly respected. They were often healers and were tasked with passing on traditional knowledge to the next generation. However, when the colonizers arrived, along with criminalizing the language and many cultural practices of the native Hawaiians, the Mahu were also heavily persecuted. The effects of that persecution still linger today. As observed in the documentary Kumuhina, which follows Hina Le Moana Wonkalu, who goes by the name Hina, a Mahu person who uses female pronouns, as she passes on traditional knowledge as a teacher in a Hawaiian charter school. She faces many of the same struggles as any modern person, as well as the difficulty in reclaiming her place in Hawaiian society post-colonization. And throughout the documentary, she is determined to make sure that there is a place for the Mahu of the upcoming generations in the future.
In conclusion, it is evident that the reason that indigenous nations were more accepting of gender nonconformity and same-sex relationships is due to the fact that, while there were specific roles to be filled by both men and women in Aboriginal society, there was no hierarchy between those roles. Women were not considered as lesser than men, and as such, feminine roles were not considered as lesser than masculine roles. Whereas, within the European worldview, women were devalued, and their role in society was inferior. As such, men who would demean themselves by behaving as women were seen as wrong and behaving against the way God intended, and subsequently behaving against nature. In comparison, within the Aboriginal viewpoint, that concept of behaving against nature simply does not exist. As such, two-spirited individuals were accepted and seen as perfectly natural.